Okay, now you can start.
Okay, thank you. And so welcome everybody to this exceptional starting for our series of conferences held by the MARC in Architecture, Construction, City, which is organized by a very valuable group of PhD students and by Valeria Federighi. And we are very lucky this year because we can start this series hosting Albena Yaneva, who kindly proposed us to tell something about, to have a lecture about her last book. Albena Yaneva is professor at Manchester University, and she is professor of architectural theory. And she's also been visiting professor in Politecnico in 2018, if I'm not wrong. She's been a visiting professor at Princeton School of Architecture as well. And she has wide known for her research in architectural theory and specifically in architectural practice theory, let's say. So we hosted here also for some months. She worked with us and with our students, and today she's going to present this last book, which is a book about archives. The title is Crafting History, Archiving and a Quest for Architectural Legacy. So I think this is a very important, and we're very honored to host this appointment, because this book has been presented, I think, 1 month ago in Princeton University with Mark Wigley. So we are very honored to follow that meeting. And I think it's very, very important to understand how Albena can tell something about the archival cosmos, let's say, which is it's a sort of a dimension which allows us to see the practice of architecture, not only seen by practitioners, but by all the actors who contribute to build this dimension of architecture. And I think that this is very, very important to us for understanding how the practice of projects and can be taught, it can be understood through the archives, and when we make projects, we are actually making archives as well. So maybe this is a very interesting opportunity for discussing with Albena about this, about the relation between archives and projects in architecture. So I give you the floor, and I thank you again for being here with us. Please, Albena, you can start.
Thank you. Thank you, Alessandro, Valeria, Giovanni. I cannot see all the colleagues, but I thank you for this invitation, for this opportunity to share this work with you and your students today. Can you see the screen?
We see your main screen, not the presentation. Yes, now we see the presentation. Perfect.
All right. Yeah. So thank you. So the title of the lecture is Crafting History, Archiving Matters for Design, which is one aspect of the book Crafting History that Alessandro mentioned today. And this study of archiving, as you can see from the title I have chosen for today's presentation, I don't talk about archives, but archiving as a process that matters for design and design practice. As you can see from the title, that it's that particular aspect between archiving and design that I would like to explore today. today and present today to you for the first time since the book is out. So this study of archiving is motivated by a number of recent developments in the social sciences, in philosophy, in anthropology and the arts. All of these developments happened in the 90s. We have the archive fever, a concept of Derrida in the 90s, a concept in philosophy that explains the archival impulse. Archival arts also develop in the same time in the arts in the 90s. In anthropology, at the same time, we have an archival turn with the writings of Marshall Sachlins, and a very similar development also happens in archival science, an empirical turn, we might say. So all these developments from the 90s open up new avenues for exploring architectural archives and architectural archiving as a process, and they point towards the importance to study archives in architecture. How did architectural practice look like before the 90s? That's a historical photograph that shows life in an architectural practice before AutoCAD, and what is missing, what was missing at the time was the computer. So in the late 80s, in the 90s, the computer entered architectural practice and radically transformed the design. The awareness that the paper drawing can have an archival value gained a momentum at that time. So archives piled up, and big firms started appointing record managers, archivists, PR managers as well, to deal with the accumulated archives and the legacy of big practices. So these are the very first traces of archival fever in architectural practice, we might say. Also new versions of computer-aided design, form-generating software, parametric and post-parametric applications came to replace the tradition of sketching in architectural practices, gradually, of course, starting from the 90s to our days. A multiplicity of tools for video recording and data collection has added to the already diversified repertoire of archiving. So that technological moment, when digital materials moved into a dominant position, made architects much more aware of the importance of organizing archives and taking care of their own legacy. It is hard to imagine the act of designing without thinking of the archiving gesture. The amassing of archives happens as an underlying dimension of design practice, underpinning its existence. It is inherent to the creative process. So the more architects create, the messier their offices get, and thus the greater the need for organizing and archiving the material becomes. Some practices keep everything, and I have an illustration here from previous work I have done in the Office of Metropolitan Architecture in Rotterdam. So during this ethnographic observation, I have followed how form models become also part of archives. So it's not just the sketch and the drawings and the nasty letters to the client and all this kind of correspondence, but it's also the model. The model becomes archival, it becomes part, it's being packed in this huge boxes that you see on the slide, and those archives travel to storage, stay there for a while, and then come back to the office when a project is again active. And is in the practice. I have witnessed this in 2004 when I was working at the OMA practice in Rotterdam, and a few years later I witnessed the same happening in another practice, but in New York, during an interview with Peter Eisenman. He explains he also keeps everything in the practice. I quote, "We do not do any selection. When it overwhelms us, we just put everything into the storage," end of quote. So architectural practice, we see it here, naturally results in an extraordinary accumulation of visuals and archival media that demand sorting, cataloging and organizing at a certain moment in time in order to avoid the amorphous accumulation of materials in practice. Known as a great collector, surrounded by books and boxes of archival materials, pointing to them as we speak, Eisenman explains, "As a collector, I keep scraps of paper, letters, and other materials. I have, for example, a box here with over 40 letters of Calling Row. And they're amazing letters, but I even didn't know I had them, so I must have forgotten about those letters. And they're very important letters at the time when he studied in the 60s at Cambridge, and he keeps them as a part of this collection. So as we discuss the role of collections in practice, Eisenman carefully traces the distinction between collection claiming that all his collections, books, magazines, letters, drawings by Palladio and alike, are not consciously archival. So archiving, we see it here, requires an extra effort to organize, catalog, take inventory, code, preserve, and maintain a collection. So while collections inspire design, and we all have all sorts of collections that could be part of the inspirational machine of architectural practices, so collections inspire design, the archive is a product of design. And the archive is embedded in design present. So that's an important distinction to have in mind. In recent years, we have witnessed a seismic shift, argued Barry Bergdahl, when contemporary architects began getting valuation of their own work. So at the beginning, they were even grateful if someone was interested in having their drawings because space is a problem. So they felt lucky to have a dedicated space for the drawings, and they would donate them. But then recently, drawings have become a profit kind of center, argues Bergdahl, and architects engage in different processes of valuation as if they were selling Picassos. End of quote from Barry Bergdahl. So some of the architects, contemporary architects in particular, went as far as to set up their own foundations to prepare for their own legacies. And of course, when we say foundations, we're usually thinking about the works of famous modernist architects like Le Corbusier, the foundation of Le Corbusier, which we see here on this slide, for instance, being a model, or Frank Lloyd Wright, so being the models of foundations organized around the legacy of one particular architectural oeuvre. But what we witness in the last, I would say 10 years is a number of contemporary architects setting up their own foundations following this model. And I will list some of these foundations. We have Norman Foster's Foundation in Madrid, which was set up in 2015. Renzo Piano's Foundation in Genova was set up in 2008. Herzog and de Meuron Cabinet in Basel, or Zaha Hadid also, she began setting up the Zaha Hadid Foundation in 2013 prior to her death, and I can continue the list. Each of these foundations holds archives and libraries of the respective architects with the aim of exhibiting and promoting the legacy of their work into posteriority. So all these developments, all these recent developments point to the need to question the role of archives in contemporary architecture. So my ambition here with this study and this book is to shift the scholarly attention from the archive to the practices of archiving. The aim is to explore the specific mechanisms of archival production today and to understand how archiving matters for practicing architects, how archiving connects to designing. As archives are embedded in the design present, I ask the questions: what constitutes an architectural archive today? To what extent does design work depend on the intimacy with now? What kind of tools, technologies, and crafts are needed in archiving? Or in short, what kind of craft is archiving? As an anthropologist, I focus on the present, and I advocate a type of architectural anthropology which in its mundane and practical materiality. I treat archives not as sites of knowledge retrieval, not as sources, but as sites of knowledge production. And I'm interested to understand the ontological granularity of the archive. I rely on interviews with practitioners, as well as a number of participants in archiving, and also ethnographic observation of the practices of archivists, catalogers, conservators, architects, curators, museum technicians, and other participants in this process, to be able to trace the everyday rhythm of archiving as a way to access the specificity of the current conditions of architecture making. So archiving always connects to architectural design in the story that I'll present today. So my ambition with this study is to bring new awareness for architectural scholars of how archives are made. After all, research in archives is where historical science is marked with epistemological credentials. For practicing architects, this study can signal a fresh way to grapple with the production of architecture. Organizing a working archive in a firm is not an innocent matter. It reflects its creative culture. And this study can also contribute to initiating new conversations between archivists and architectural scholars. In 2014, I found myself in the Canadian Centre of Architecture in Montreal. So I began a study at the CCA. This is the most prestigious, the most well-known archival institution in the world for architectural archives, for architectural collections. But it's not the visible CCA that I was interested in, with its established programs, architectural publications, exhibitions, etc., as a leading institution setting up the tone of architectural discourse in contemporary societies. It's not this visible CCA that I wanted to understand, but the invisible one. Many different sites of archiving where architectural objects have a hidden and very often unaccounted life. So I visited many of those hidden sites that usually an architectural scholar or an architect visiting the CCA would not normally see. I visited the vaults where archivists and curators often look at objects and try to select specific objects for exhibits, publications. The shipping area where the objects are first arrive and where Alexandre and Marie open the boxes with objects and the crates and try to establish the state of the objects, whether they smell or not, whether there is a problem, and they urgent need of care. The conservation lab, where you can see huge models being restored and then packed again and prepared for another stage of their life, for an exhibit, for a travel, or the catalogers, the work of the catalogers, transforming the objects into codes and signs, the workshops where they're being prepared for exhibits, the offices of the curators, the discussions of curators, museum technicians, and architects preparing the objects for exhibits and for travels again, or for the architectural researchers. So all these hidden sites of architectural objects, I wanted to sites to another. How I wanted to trace the different daily choices of identifying, describing, characterizing, but also valuing the objects, measuring the objects, documenting, coding, registering the objects, and taking care of them, and trace the trajectories of those objects and the work of all those participants in archiving that usually remains hidden and invisible to architectural scholars and practitioners. For today's lecture, I have chosen an example from one of the most important recent acquisitions of the CCA, the Alvaro Scissors Fund, and I will show two episodes from the hidden life of objects from Alvaro Scissors' archive, which have been recently acquired by the CCA. So as my study began unfolding over the summer of 2015, I witnessed the very first boxes of Scissors Archive arriving in Montreal after a very long journey from distant Portugal. These boxes contained projects of scissors practice developed between the 1950s and 2010. To understand the process of archiving, of course, we cannot just stay and contemplate the boxes. We have to understand their trajectory, and we have to visit a number of different cities as well, which I did. So Porto is the first city of interest, and here we are in Caesar, this is a small house at Rua de Alexo in Porto. The office is still very active. There are a number of interesting projects, so I visited the office and have interviewed Caesar at the time, and in the ground floor there is a well-organized archive in Caesar's practice, in Caesar's possession. Montreal is the other side, where you can see on the upper part of the slide well-arranged boxes and the vaults with organized materials. So in Porto, in addition to Caesar, I also met archivists, two archivists, Cara Porcho and Magda Seifert. In Montreal, I met a number of archivists, Adria, Pamela, Robert, and conservators like Karen and David, etc. And I can continue the list. So it's a large crowd of actors who take part in the processing and rehousing of the archive. So in addition to traveling between these two cities, Porto and Montreal, and trying to understand how objects travel through many different sites of archiving, I also met a number of other actors which made possible the Caesar's font, Caesar's acquisition to Montreal, Mirko Zardini, the director of the CCA at the time, Martin de Vlitter, the collection director, the founder of the CCA, Phyllis Lambert, the chief curator, Giovanna Borazzi, all of them telling a story about the split of the archive, about the rationale of Caesar for joining the CCA, and the negotiation process of acquiring an archive. And I can continue the list of actors that we need to follow in order to understand the complexity of an archive of that scale. They all travel, all these actors also travel to different cities, and I went back and forth between Montreal and Porto, and so I did over the course of 3 years. My study ended in 2018. And all these actors are important, but the key hero of my story is the archivist Cara Porcho, who was the archivist working on this archive, with this archive for the last 30 years. So I will focus on the work of Cara. I will zoom into her daily work of archiving so we can understand what an archivist does and how it's related to the work of an archivist is related to the process of design. Archiving is not a recent activity for the firm of Caesar. So Caesar's practice began organizing the archive long time ago, and I will quote here architect Caesar explaining the start of his archive. I quote, Caesar says, I started my practice in 54, and by the 90s, so again, the 90s is a key moment for us, there was a mountain of documents accumulated, and I felt the need to organize these documents. Just look at his gesture. So this mountain, he points to this kind of accumulation of paper, the mountains of paper. And we can see that the archive fever is linked to the messiness of design and the desire to clean the office, to organize the material, but also to prepare the space for new projects. The 1993 is Pritzker Prize recognition for his work also led to more commissions, more projects, and gradually also to more mountains of paper. And therefore the need for archiving became even more pressing in the practice. Trained as an architect, Cara, sitting next to architect Caesar on this picture, Cara started working with Caesar in the 80s on a number of projects, and at the end of the 90s, she became his archivist. In the 90s, there were a number of influential projects in the office, such as the Faculty of Architecture at the University of Porto, the Chiado, the Torrent van Cisa, and I can continue the list. And it became difficult to search for materials in the piles. So Chiara was also the youngest architect at the practice at the time, and she was often sent to look for materials in those piles. So it was difficult to find materials. And she started organizing the archive by introducing original order in these piles of documents, and this original order closely reflected her knowledge of the firm. So what you can see on this slide is an extremely well organized archive in the practice of CISA on the ground floor, where Chiara works in the same building where the practice is situated, Rua del Lexo. So the entire ground floor is her archival kingdom, we might say. With the years, Chiara gradually developed a very specific knowledge of the work of CISA. A knowledge of where the things stood in the archive, on that shelf or on that drawer, in that drawer. So knowing where, as we see here, is a very specific type of knowledge, and a knowledge how. It is different from the factual knowledge about architecture. It's different from propositional knowledge. It is true inserting, inspecting, and memorizing as repetitive series of operations that Chiara gained the knowledge where. The minute skill of knowing where is often compared to the grandiose ambition of knowing all about CISA. His architectural work, but also his sculptures, paintings, exhibitions, writings, and the various collaborations. I quote Chiara here. I only know part of CISA. This is after 30 years of working with CISA. I only know part of CISA, she says. There's absolutely nobody who could know the overall work. Archiving, we see it here, confronts the archivist with the very partial character of human knowledge and the impossibility of gaining an all-encompassing comprehension of the work of a practice. It also reveals how architecture is part of a broader network of entangled fields, arts, and industries, never an isolated bubble. Archiving is, we see it here, is not about knowing all, knowing everything, but it's about knowing a little, but knowing it well. Knowing also where to find more when it's needed. The life on the second floor, where the practice is situated, is overflowing with surprises. It's very active, it's very hectic. However, a project only travels downstairs to the kingdom of Chiara when it is stopped, put on hold, or entirely completed. CISA and Chiara communicate on a daily basis, so the practice and the archivist, the practitioners and the archivist are constantly in dialogue. We see Chiara preparing a drawing for CISA because it's urgent. She works like a surgeon, very carefully manipulating the drawing. CISA calls her a number of times because it's urgent. She goes upstairs in the practice to bring the drawing. And very often we can see also CISA downstairs on the ground floor consulting the archive. So the practice and the archive are always in communication. Have a look at some materials that CISA had just given to Chiara. It's not a selection, but it's a bunch of things that contains a little bit of everything. Drawings and copies, it's just what was on his desk a moment ago, now ends up with Chiara. A message on the front page reads, from architect CISA to Chiara. Chiara now has to go through all these copies and sort them out. When preparing the material for Montreal, Chiara is helped by Magda, another archivist, and they go through thousands of documents and thousands of copies and copies of copies. They rarely throw things away. They keep all these versions of annotated drawings as they reveal the evolution of the drawing and the design thinking. The task of the archivist, as we see it here, is not to make selections, is not to evaluate and decide what's the correct or what's the original version and then to throw the other versions away or to destroy them. The architect keeps all these versions because they all matter for the creative process, and the role of the archivist is to guide people through all these versions. Archivists do not engage in comparing iconic images with replicas, copies, with originals, but rather maintain all these differences as having their own merits. The archive does not outline the precious first or last idea or drawing, the single creator or the original. Instead, what is foregrounded in an archive is the multiplicity, the many different variations and copies, the many different ideas, the many voices. Caesar has a very specific and unique way of drawing. With time, he also changed his way of doing things. His drawing and handwriting techniques evolved. Nothing stayed the same. Because of the constant dialogue with the practice, with time, Chiara has also cultivated a very specific skill to recognize Caesar's hand drawing and handwriting style in all their different variations. So she's an expert. She can very easily detect the differences between his style of drawing from the 50s compared to the 60s, his handwriting from the 60s compared to the 70s. She can detect Caesar's handwriting over the drawings of other collaborators, or how a sketch from a completely different project has landed over the drawings of another building, and she can disentangle all these different layers of a complex drawing like the one you see on this slide. Caesar's collaborators very often try to mimic the way he draws. And the small differences in the drawings between Caesar's original drawings and the collaborators' drawings trying to imitate his style, these small differences are very hard to detect. But Chiara gradually learned to distinguish these hardly noticeable variations for they in a practice. Drawing has many layers, many signs, as we see on this picture, and all those signs can be only grasped and fully deciphered by an archivist. Signs are enigmas, and they are the object of a temporal apprenticeship, not an abstract knowledge. Becoming an archivist, as we witness here, is grounded in an apprenticeship to the signs of the drawing and the multiple layers and overlapping temporalities of a design process. As Chiara worked on over the years, the archive also trained her, and I quote her words here, "The archive started training me." The archive trained her to think through these signs, to interpret them, and to translate them. As archivists perform a reading of all those signs, like hieroglyphs, they reconnect events, people, things, and sequences, and indulge in traceability. At the same time, the architects very often come downstairs to consult the archive and to learn from the archive, and to re-examine all projects and buildings, as buildings also age and they require intervention. So if, for instance, Caesar is supposed to intervene in a building designed in the 60s, he will come downstairs to consult that particular archive from the 60s to be able to learn from this archive and better adjust his interventions in the building. So both archivists and architects run back and forth in time to find, interpret, and reactivate the signs of design. Archival materials, as we see, are rare epistemic objects that remain connected to the current dynamics of design. Working with series of copies, detecting small differences in signs, tracing new connections between different materials, the archivists perform a skeletal epistemological structuring of the works of Caesar's firm that will eventually become imprinted in the classification scheme of the archive and will prepare the ground for the work of the researchers at the CCA. Back to Montreal, the work continues. The boxes arrive and the CCA and the CCA archivist Adria, which you see on the picture, opens those boxes and she starts rehousing the material, placing it in acid-free folders and establishing new connections through physical displacement. This afternoon, in the vault, I of presets and completing a huge Excel file, numbering and describing the object. So just like Chiara, Adri is able to extract new knowledge and engage in additional reading of those signs. The work of archiving continues. It generates a configuration of new relations where knowing becomes possible. However, Adria can stop at any moment and ask, why is this document here? And she takes this question to Chiara, calling her or zooming her to talk to her to Porto. And if Chiara cannot answer this question, the question will go back to architect Caesar or one of his collaborators. So a simple question like this reveals both Chiara's reading of Caesar's work as well as Caesar's own interpretation of how his work is to be archived, structured, and understood. In this chain of interpretations, which involve different temporalities, people, and practices, more knowledge about Caesar's design process is gained. This knowledge gradually leads towards the production of the CCA map of Caesar's font. Once in the CCA, the objects continue to travel to different sites of archiving. Let's have a look at another episode from the life of architectural objects. And let's stay for a while in another site of archiving, the conservation lab. Here, we witness archival objects constantly battling uncertainty, the erosion of time, begging for care and attention, negotiating with the environment. It's a quasi-medical environment, as we see, and even the vocabulary of the quasi-medical So they talk about health check of the objects, diagnosis, treatment, test. And this is part of their language and terminology, the terminology of the conservators working in the lab. The objects that we see here are in a state of degradation or in process of fading or aging. They're in urgent need of care. The discussions here revolve around solvents, smells, or the possible infestation of drawings. On this site of archiving, we see chemical products, controlled temperatures and different instruments, from the simple pipettes and scalpels, spatulas, knives and sponges, which you see all around the lab, to the huge and sophisticated microscope manipulating microscope and using it to inspect carefully objects and identify the media, or to look for specific scratches and flaws in an old drawing. So here architectural objects are very carefully inspected and described, and a condition report is prepared. This is the stage of diagnosis, of scrutinizing the symptoms and detecting flaws of the archival objects. A simple drawing and sketch, like the one we have seen a moment ago in the practice of Caesar, when examined under the microscope in the lab, suddenly multiplies to over 50 different features, as you see on the condition report here. A close look at the report can show these 40 features could be as varied as establishing different tears, scratches, folds, dirt, decoloration, cracks, insect damages, stains, and I can continue the list of the many different imperfections we can find in a simple, small architectural photograph or drawing. After this careful report is produced, Karen, another conservator in the lab, will perform a treatment of the architectural object if needed. This could include oxidation, deinfestation, neutralization of smell, restoration, and cleaning. Look at the bodily posture of conservators. Look at Karen leaning towards the object, engaging in a highly mediated, slow, and meticulous process of caretaking. So all these procedures go in tandem with specific techniques of documenting and inscribing the traces of interventions and lead to the production of more working scripts, protocols, reports, notes, and measurements. They all aim at stabilizing the object, making them more resilient and less dependent on the environment, allowing them to sustain the readability of science. At the end of the process, archival objects are fully prepared to embrace a new life. Let's say they could either go into an exhibit to be viewed and appreciated by architectural scholars and viewers, or to devote to be consulted by researchers and practicing architects. Thus, I have illustrated here just 2 episodes .
Albena, maybe you switched off your microphone. Yes, now.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right.
Okay.
I have illustrated here a few episodes from the hidden life of architectural objects as they travel from an architectural practice to a well-organized archive in Caesar's possession, and from this archive to an archival institution like the CCA and the many different sites of archiving that we can discover there within this institution. So this is just an illustration of 2 episodes from the hidden life of architectural objects. In conclusions, as we see here, the architectural archive is not just the reflection of the mind of an architect. It's a much more complex, additive entity that takes inspiration from design as a collective. It is a relational aggregate of working materials, copies, versions of drawings that all document the thinking process, plus the many participants in design, plus many different design dynamics that can be witnessed, plus different technologies, different skills, plus social and cultural issues entangled with architecture that we can witness and discover through the archive. It's a context and content at the same time. So far from idealizing entirely the archive with a capital A as an ultimate source of architectural knowledge, or a supreme technology of architectural history with capital H, what I advocate here is the need to study archiving as a process and all participants in archiving. So while Caesar's name is already engraved in the golden books of architectural history, no one has ever heard of Chiara, Adria, Pamela, Karen, David, Anne, and I can continue the list of many archivists, museum technicians, conservators, and catalogers who spend years and years archiving and processing this archive and taking care of specific objects. So tracing the moves of archiving allows us to witness the usually invisible work of all these actors who generally remain silent and outside the limelight of mainstream architectural historiography. Moreover, archiving is never about a specific object, but about architectural material of larger social and epistemic importance for the discipline. The situated practices of sign reading, which we have witnessed here, of arranging, cataloging, caretaking, and preserving objects, generate larger structural effects in an archive, effects that resonate with greater epistemological anxieties in the discipline and the profession. Archiving emphasizes the active and reciprocal nature of architectural knowledge. It is a way of extracting, correcting, and interpreting knowledge that will form the epistemological basis of architectural scholarship. It is a way of crafting history. Thank you.
Thank you, Albena. Thank you for this lecture. And it was very, very effective. And I would like to encourage immediately some questions from many people we have here. I know we have also some colleagues, we have historians, we have students. So before starting the discussion on my own, I would invite people to ask you something and to try to comment with you the many suggestions you gave about us, about our experience as well. Because I mean, as architects, we always archive our practice every day, even if we are not Alvaro Siza, and even if we do not consider the importance of our products, documental products, but still we need to do it as students as well. So maybe, is there anybody who wants to ask something to Albena about this? I can bring the ice maybe, just starting from the end. And because you were in the last part of your lecture, you were mentioning before the conclusions, you said at the end of the process. So is there any end of a process of archiving? How would you define the ending of an archival enterprise, even in a very important case as a CISA? Because what is the end of it? Is a full digitalization? Is a full access? Maybe is a full availability of the documents, of the relations? Is there the last order of relations, which gives us back the processes, the practices, the events which are embedded within them? What do you think about it?
Yeah, that's a very important question indeed. If we follow all the sites of archiving, there will be no end, yeah? Because you can go from one site to another and you can unravel many different trajectories of architectural objects. What's important to mention is also the cataloging happens at the group level. So they might be like a group of drawings with boxes, but that are cataloged as a group object, but never at the object level. So an object is taken out of the group, out of the bunch of things that are closed in a box, only if the object is supposed to be part of an exhibit or a publication, and then it gains an object, a kind of a single number, and it will be singled out and it will be treated in conservation labs. So this kind of singled objects that go out of the box will have a completely different trajectory. These objects will be a public life in the gallery or in a publication. So these objects will be viewed, will be exposed, will become very eloquent, will be in the limelight of public attention. And this could be interpreted as a kind of end of a glorious trajectory of archiving, whereas the other objects will remain in the box and will perhaps care and attention. So I was amazed to see through the fieldwork in the CCA how many boxes are never opened, how many crates are never opened, and what kind of treasures are there in an institution like the CCA, which were never kind of discovered, and probably will never be discovered fully by architectural scholars, because very often whether an archive is consulted or not depends on current trends in architectural kind of research, current hypes in architectural scholarship, different discourses that we have about architecture. So the discoverability of the objects will depend really on our interest in those objects. Also, depending on the problems that these objects have, this circularity, the trajectory of the objects from one side to another will have a different dynamics. And in some cases, it never ends. As you said, this is not like a linear process of step-by-step progression from the architectural practice towards a very specific linear course, linear trajectory that will lead the object to the exhibition or the public attention of a publication, but it depends very often what the objects are needed for. The objects consulted. For instance, a practicing architect might need a very specific archive because of a renovation project and could go and consult the archive. But these objects will never be then taken, will never go to the conservation lab to be restored. They will be consulted privately by architects within the vaults or the study room of the CCA, and therefore, depending on the purpose of the consultation, in the users of the archive. In this case, the user is a practicing architect. Depending on the user, the object will travel from, it will have a different trajectory between sites of archiving. It's never linear, it's never one trajectory. There are many possible trajectories and therefore many possible ends to respond to your question. Many possible beginnings and ends.
Thank you. Yes, it's very clear. No, I think also there's a huge difference. Maybe you wrote something in the book about this, between the use of our archive as an ongoing part of the practice. So the archiving action, while you are working as a practitioner, you have your own archive and you do things with your own archive because you are doing something, because you have a specific objective, or if you are, for instance, a famous architect, someone keeps your documents and organize them and uses that for exhibitions or even for historical work, or teaching and transmitting your knowledge or what you did in the past for someone else. So it seems to be two deeply different ways to consider the archive. The archive of the practice and the archive of the memory of the practice, the historical archive. I don't know if there's something.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Very often, as a practitioner, you might not consider something of importance to the others, and I have seen this in the Caesar case. For instance, his sketchbooks. His sketchbooks were kept in his own house and were not considered as part of the archive at the start, and he kept sketchbooks, which you have seen on one of the images. He started doing the sketchbooks in the 50s. So there is a huge collection, as you can imagine, with sketchbooks, which were almost like personal diaries. When he would travel, he would take notes. He also can draw connected to a particular project, or he can sketch the faces of clients and collaborators while he is sitting in a meeting. And not all this information is related to projects, but there were some very precious drawings and schemes that could be also taken part from the sketches. So from the sketchbooks, from these travel books in a way. So this was not considered by Caesar as important part of his archive, but little by little, the CCA convinced him that it's important to at least take some of those drawings and add them to the well-organized archive already. And they did this one day. They brought all the sketchbooks to the office and selected carefully the material that is relevant to the specific projects, and those projects that go to the CCA in particular. And some of the sketchbooks were also donated to the CCA and connected to the archive. So you're very right that sometimes we don't realize that something that is a working material or part of our personal archive could be also important source for understanding the creative work of a practice, and could become part of the archive as well. Your question had another interesting aspect that we could perhaps distinguish between the archive as an active memory of the practice, and especially with the practice that is still active at the moment. It's a library of things that are constantly mobilized in design, and they're constantly needed for the functioning of the design practice, because it's not just the memory, but it's an active library of ideas that are part of the style of this practice in a way. And we constantly need it because it's part of our extended technical memory as a group, as a practice. And then it's a different question when the practice is not active any longer, and then the archive is donated to an institution like the CCA, the archive gains a completely different status.
Yeah, sure. Albena, there are some questions also in the chat. The first one is by Catalina, who's asking if it's considered the digital documentation as a method of archiving, taking into account nowadays exists some platform for that. So how do you consider it in your work, maybe also?
Yeah, that's a very important question. Thank you, Catalina. I do spend time. I have one chapter discussing digital archiving. I look at the practices of digital archivists as well, which is important, and also the two-dimensional digitization of existing material of paper archives, and also digital-born archive. So these two different aspects of digital archiving, of course, have their own challenges and their own complexity, especially digital-born archives are extremely challenging, and the digital objects are much more complex than the paper objects, which we have seen in this lecture. I only talked about paper archives and paper archiving, but digital archiving has a completely different network of actors, completely different protagonists involved, entire networks, in fact, involved in the archiving, as the digital archivists have to think carefully not what will happen with a file or a software in 20 years from now, and how the researcher will be able to open a file. So technical issues like this of how you preserve the integrity of a file system, how you keep this within the kind of technological development of a software, so that the digital, that a researcher or a practicing architect can open this material, consult, and get the information 20 years from now. So they always think forward. There's always a thinking forward of what will happen in 20 years and how do we remain relevant and how do we prepare for the technological challenges that in 20 years from now. It's one question is the technology, another question is the copyrights issues, software development. So all these kind of technological developments have to be taken. Of course, the digital archival object much more complex, much more versatile. So in a paradoxical way, a paper drawing from 17th century is perhaps much more resilient and easier to preserve than a digital file from the 90s.
Mm-hmm. That's a very important aspect, I think, and also all these considerations around the archives that you're offering us are also a very important connection between history of architecture and architectural design practice. We have we have a doctoral course about history and projects. So I think this is exactly the connector between these two sides of architectural knowledge. And about our history of architecture, there's also Michela Rosso, who's an historian, our colleague of us, who was telling you something. Maybe, I don't know if Michela is still with us, but yes, I see her.
Yes, I am.
I don't know, Michela, if you want to say with voice your question directly, so I don't read it. And
okay. Good afternoon. Yes, I followed the lecture because I found this idea of kind of researching and looking at very closely at the so-called, well, Albena defines that as the hidden life of architectural objects or architectural documents, okay? So very interesting. Also because, well, I haven't been at the CCA for some time, so I remember also those places. And it's my question was, well, more than a question, is a kind of I don't know, sort of truth that I'm witnessing, which is the fact that the way architects or artists archive their work, they invent their work, they catalog the work, is a sort, perhaps could be considered as a sort of autobiography or sort of attempt at representing themselves according to an image of themselves, according to I don't know, yes, the ambition to preserve and communicate a certain reputation, a certain image. So I think, of course, archiving and cataloging all these materials implies a sort of strategy, and it's not, of course, a neutral activity. So, of course, it goes on to affect the work of the researcher, the work of the historian, whether it is a historian of architecture or simply a researcher on architecture. Of course, the archive affects and in almost, I would say, undoubtedly, there's no doubt about that. Okay, so I was just wondering whether you have any specific episode or example of this relationship. I mean, in your study, you came across, I mean, for instance, Alvaro Siza or other architects you have observed and studied closely with the attention to the archive, to the process of archiving these materials. Have you ever found any example of this strict relationship between, I mean, the way the archive was organized and was transmitted and was organized, and the way the work of the architect was interpreted or was read and yes, and studied in a way. Yeah, that's very, very, very general question, and I also imagine not very easy to to answer. But yeah, just wanted to say that. Unfortunately, I don't have so much time to participate in the discussion because there is another lecture. By the way, you quoted Barry Bergdahl. There is a lecture about 19th century architecture given by Barry Bergdahl together with Anthony Widler now, starting just in 5 minutes.
Okay, very quick.
Yeah.
All right, so I'll have to respond to your questions quickly then. Yeah, thank you, Michaela. These are very important questions. And there is indeed, in some cases, a very deliberate construction of the archive, which in a way will format the way the work of an architect, the oeuvre of the architect will be interpreted, yeah, because it's selected, it's well organized, perhaps some of the things, some aspects of the work are entirely cleaned or deleted, and there is a deliberate construction. So at the CCA, they distinguish between the messy archive, the chaotic archive, and the well-organized or well-sanitized archive, they say it. So archives could arrive at the CCA in these two different forms. The well-organized archive contains traces of this construction, as you say, and this is not an innocent construction. It does give us directions of how the work could be interpreted and what kind of meanings and architectural interpretations, historical or theoretical, we could gain from this organized archive. And we know in architectural history to what extent the abundant archive, the distinction between the abundant archive and the scarce archive conditions a certain volume of architectural kind of scholarship. The famous example of Le Corbusier, which was an obsessive archivist, and Adolf Loos, who destroyed his archives, of course, explains why there's so much written on Le Corbusier and little written on Loos. But in addition to this famous example, we can, of course, bring contemporary examples. So the well-organized and the chaotic or the messy archive will give shape to a completely different architectural forms of scholarship and different epistemological avenues for interpreting the work of a practice or the work of an architect. In the messy archives, very often, these are archives that have been stored in the cellar of a practice or which have been donated by a widow or by a practice after the practice has split. So there was no effort or no archivist in place like in in CISA's practice, an archivist have worked 30 years to organize and structure well the material. And when there was no archivist and no attempt to organize the archive in these boxes are like boxes of wonder, like a cabinet of de curiosité. You can have all sorts of objects coming out of those boxes. Some of them are relevant to the understanding of the work of a practice. Some of them are completely irrelevant. So in this case, the CCA will sort out the materials and will return the objects that have no relevance for architectural scholarship will be returned to the family of the architect. But what is important here is, no matter what the state of the archive is, messy or well organized, what is important also for architectural scholarship and the construction of an argument by a historian is that all these archives, this body of work of different practices, find themselves in adjacency in one institution. So when you go to the CCA, you can consult CISA, but also Aldo Rossi, and then James Sterling, and all this kind of post-war period. For instance, if you want to look at the post-war architecture, you can go from one project to another, and you can do a transversal cut in history, and therefore a transversal interpretation is possible. And in that sense, no matter how constructed or not well organized an archive is, it's up to you as an architectural historian to perform the transversal readings that you wish to perform in the institutional, in the collection of the CCA and other archival institutions, if this is possible.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Michela, for the question, and Albena for this huge answer about this. And of course, it's a big issue. And yes, I would like to follow some other question maybe before closing this this meeting. And there's Ray who were just commenting the Michela's question about the fact that there can be some kind of manipulation by architects on about their history and the autobiography, scientific autobiography through archives. And so I would go to the following one as well, which is Youssef. Youssef says the theme of archive digitalization involves a different social relationship. What type of relation can we lost in this process? Is there, I don't know, this is a very important question, I think, because the importance and the relevance of the documents is directly connected to the fact that you can put them into a course of actions, let's say. Okay, so maybe you can say something about this.
Yeah, that's a very important question, because especially with the digital born archives, there's a very active dialogue with the creators of the archives, the practices, which are very important for the preserving of the digital born, which we don't have with archives of, let's say, Aldo Rossi or Sterling, and archives that do not contain digital born material, for instance. So here we have this type of relationships that are much more active. Very often when we revisit archives without being able to question the creator, either the architect or the archivist, we have to rely on our own interpretation. So we cannot go back and question the rationale for organizing the archive in one particular way or another, whereas with the digital we can do this. We can also discuss other important relations are relations with entire, I would say, huge networks of practitioners outside the field of architecture, like IT experts, software developers, copyright specialists, digital heritage specialists, institutions also behind those experts have to be there, and everything has to be aligned and in place so that we can preserve a file for the years to come, and also so we make sure that CD or disc does not remain just a piece of plastic, which is what we see with archives from sometimes from the 90s, that if like a CD was placed in a big box of material which was never opened after 1996, let's say, and then 10 years later is discovered among many other drawings and stuff, nobody can open this CD, and we don't know what was lost. So we very often don't know what was lost because it was never opened or taken care of. Sometimes it's important to establish those relationships and to be able to preserve and take care of those precarious materials that that digital materials are.
Yeah, maybe we discovered too late how fragile were the CD bases, because we made a lot of backups in the last decades on CDs, and now we cannot find it anymore because they're lost. They're literally lost. In fact, the aspect you highlight before about the fact that the drawings in 18th century were much more resistant reminds me about what Francesca is saying. Francesca Favaro is working, she's a PhD student, she's working on 18th century architect and his archive, Rittone. So she was making some considerations around what you did, what you said. Said that, yeah, historians often interact with the unintentional professional archives, not organized to be transmitted, but it does not change the fact that the architect has in any case archived these documents, and that this practice of archiving has also strongly influenced his design practice. Yes, Francesca, maybe you can follow briefly about what you wrote. I see your appearance on the screen, and maybe you can explain on your own what I were reading.
Yes, but it was just a reflection about the unintentional archives, because, for example, during my during the work for my PhD thesis, I'm dealing with unintentional archives, and so it's just a reflection. And I also read your book, and so it was very inspiring for my thesis. So thank you very much for your work, your book.
Thank you. If I understand well the question, the unintentional archive is the active archive, right? What we need on a daily basis as a kind of extension of our memory as designers, as previous design projects, as a catalog of ideas that are there at hand, but also part of this kind of technical memory of the practice. And it's not intentionally constructed to be an archive that goes in an archival institution that will enter the golden books of architectural history and that architectural scholars are supposed to consult, but it's a working archive, right? An intentional, working, active, living, breathing archive that we need, and we construct unintentionally with our design moves and in our practice on a daily basis, not just for us, but for the collective body of the practice, for the networked body of the practice. And this is an important distinction indeed.
Yes. Yes, thank you also for the question, Francesca. And there's a last question from Claudia, who's asking, in a moment in which architecture is broadening its production, where design and construction are just a part, opening up to transdisciplinary approaches, do you think the archive could be anyway a right tool to dissect and track the embedded knowledge of an architecture office? So is there anything else? Is there anything bigger or broader than the archive? What do you think?
Right. The archive is also something that could transgress those sectors of production and construction as well. Archive is not to be strictly understood as closely related just to design, imagination, and ideas, because very often in an archive we have traces of collaborations with construction industry, material quotes from construction sites, correspondence with clients and other interested parties. So we can see this kind of social, complex social and technical and construction networks of architecture. They are part of the archive as well. So we should not limit ourselves, as I understand your question, to strictly looking at the archive as a source of design imagination, as a kind of storage of creative ideas, but it's much more than this. Very often we find traces of context in Cedric Price's archive, for instance. Very often we find magazines from the time, research papers he was reading on technology. So the whole kind of spirit of the 60s is there in a box, in an archival box. So we very often find more context than architectural content, and we discover that architectural materials are very hybrid objects, and we can hardly distinguish between architectural production and all this kind of influences, contextual influences in the 60s that had an impact on the thinking of an architect. Very often they are quite entangled, all these aspects, context and content, architectural material and social, cultural, technical, sometimes political materials as well.
May I follow up on, sorry, may I follow up on this? I think this is super interesting. For example, in an institution like the CCA, following what you just said, all of the material is organized mainly by author, or is it, for example, organized, I don't know, by city agency, or are there other types of main categorization?
Yeah, that's a very good point, Valeria. In spite of the fact that we all acknowledge the collective authorship and the importance of collaborators and the kind of entangled nature of the archives, some of the archives still remain associated to one author, to one particular name, and perhaps it's a question for the future archivists and the future theorists of architecture to entirely relabel the catalog of archives in a way that the single interpretation of the single author is somehow bypassed, and a new set of categories is introduced in this kind of catalog of knowledge. So I find this an interesting tension, but it's still there. And no matter how we interpret the archive, so my research is a modest step forward towards providing a different interpretation of the archive, very different from what we have, because we usually think of the archive as this house of knowledge, of universal truths, of documents that can give us the true interpretation, the true story of things, as a reservoir of timeless knowledge about architecture. But if we look at all these hidden sides of archiving, we understand the archive is complex, there are tensions, there are confusions, it's a site of knowledge anxiety, of epistemic anxieties, and this is part of archiving as well. And this could, of course, opening the black box of the archive could, of course, lead to new interpretations in the categorization, but also in the kind of classic interpretations of architectural scholars in terms of single authorship and the kind of canonical myths of creativity that we all somehow maintain, although we are aware that we should be criticizing them and we should be proving, we should be demystifying them, and we do in many ways, but in archival institutions like the CCA, somehow this tension is maintained. So it's a modest step towards a different way of thinking the archive, and this different way of of interpreting architectural scholarship that goes beyond the traditional myths of single author, original idea, final drawing, original and copy, all this kind of classic myths of creativity that we maintain.
Yeah. Yeah, I think also Elena was stressing out the problem of resistance of supports. And I think that maybe Albena, I don't know, but if you had to make such a work like what you did now in 10 years or 20 years or 30 years, maybe the archival ontology will be completely different. Both because the production of architects will be completely digital, and because also the material, the paper production will be transferred to digital supports, probably also in the past. So this is a new horizon of relations, and also the labelization you were mentioning before becomes almost something which is more abstract, because the description you make about the keeping things at CCA, it's still related to a very traditional practice of having something which is a treasure, which has also an economic value because you have the original drawing of that architect or whatever. But in the moment you have transferred everything to the cloud and the mountain has been transformed completely into a cloud, maybe something changes definitely, and something new could emerge from that in terms of learning, of knowing, and maybe the practice of archiving is passing. Now we are witnessing the passage, epochal passage to something else. I don't know what you think about this, if you have some kind of imagination or projection about this in the future.
Yeah, that's very important, and Elena also raises an interesting question that all these kind of devices, the material support of the digital, also will need preservation, maybe a different conservation lab for all these devices as well, for a file to be opened or a technological system to be sustained so that the architectural information remains readable. Of course, it's a completely different politics of care that the digital requires. I, however, don't think that will fully replace the paper drawing. That will fully destroy it. It has to be, I mean, a kind of end of the world scenario where all paper archives are destroyed, and storage, humidity, what circumstance we can imagine that we cannot, we'll never be able to see an original drawing of Chandigarh and witness the kind of the enigma of being in front of this drawing, and the kind of attraction to the temptation to touch the drawing and to interact with the drawing, and replace this moment, this archival moment, with the pure digital equivalent, the digitized copy of the Chandigarh drawings or Palladio drawing, and we can continue the list. I cannot fully imagine the digital entirely taking over. So no, whatever paper material, but also old models and other archival materials, we're not just talking about drawing sketches, but also working drawings, versions, things that are written on tracing paper, on napkins, sometimes materials that are not supposed to endure, that have fragile material support. So all these things are preserved somehow, no matter what kind of state they are, and we can see all those traces, all this kind of heterogeneous objects, and they witness for that creative moment back in the 60s or back in 19th century, when an architect was thinking and creating in a particular cultural or social moment. So that's what the kind of the archival material brings. It reenacts this moment of creativity, but also this very specific connection of architecture and culture, or the society where architecture was produced, which the digital cannot fully communicate. So I do think that although most of the current projects will produce digital-born archive, that I do think that we'll continue to maintain a hybrid archive, and the future historian and architectural scholar will definitely work with a hybrid archive of both material and digital.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I hope you're right, and I think you're right in this as an architect as well, loving the drawings. So, Albena, thank you very much for all your time and your bright explanations and answers to all these questions. I think our time has finished. You've been so generous. We have gone beyond the 2:30, which was the deadline of this conference, and we have to close it. So thank you again for this. Thank you all, Valeria and all the crew who was organizing these conferences. I think this is the best starting we could have this year. And so thank you again, and see you very soon. And
thank you for having me. Thank you, Alessandro, Valeria.
Thank you, Albena. Thank you